Okay, this probably should have been the third video, but oh well, here we are. So in this video, I'm finally going to go ahead and address gyro activation. And so I'm basically going to show you why, personally, I've settled on using Flick Stick Disable for my gyro setting with the gyro always on by comparing it to the thing that I'm trying to replicate. So let me get into the pros and cons of different types of gyro activation, and let me try to explain to you why I feel that buttons for recentering the camera are a lot like training wheels, in that it's something that seems like it could be good, but in reality, it's holding you back. So what do I mean by training wheels? Well, there's this video I watched a while back, just kind of out of the blue, that I'll put in the description. And well, it's about just that, training wheels. Because what is the idea behind training wheels? The idea is to keep kids from falling off their bike so they learn how to pedal. The short version is, though, that in order to actually ride a bike, that's not the skill you need to learn in order to actually ride a bike. In order to actually learn how to ride a bike, you need to learn how to balance on it. And that is something that training wheels does not teach you, because training wheels is doing the balancing for you. What does that remind you of? So basically, that video explains that if you want someone to learn how to ride a bike, they need to get what's called a balance bicycle. It's basically a bike that you can stand on that is really hard to fall off of because you can basically just stand on it. Anyways, what this has to do with gyro is there's a similar barrier of entry when it comes to learning how to use gyro. And much like training wheels, camera recentering seems like a good idea until you realize that it's taking away your ability to learn a very specific skill that I think is necessary to gyro. Because being able to recenter the camera with a simple click seems like a good idea until you realize it can unsynchronize your aim. Essentially, the ideal scenario for camera recentering is you want your controller to be in your default resting position, and you recenter the camera to line up your crosshair with that position. But if you're just a little bit off, well, now the camera and your controller are unsynchronized, meaning the direction that your hands are pointing no longer line up with the direction your crosshair is facing in-game. But ideally, you want to have a certain degree of synchronization between your hands and your crosshair. So with camera recentering, this means that in order to actually use camera recentering properly, you need to move your controller from one position to your resting point and then recenter the camera. This would be the ideal way to use camera recentering. Problem is, keeping track of that in a real game can get kind of confusing, especially because there's a lot of tiny micro adjustments that you need to do to stay synchronized with your aim. And a much quicker and much simpler method of keeping this synchronized comfort, if you will, is to just use ratcheting, dedicating some part of your controller to disabling or enabling the gyro. So now, unlike camera recentering, it's the opposite. You move your crosshair to a position that is comfortable, and then you move your controller to your resting position. And the great thing about ratcheting is, unlike camera recentering, you can do this for multiple angles. So if you need to make little adjustments while looking up or down, you can do that, which is something that you can't really do with camera recentering. So I hope what I'm saying makes sense, because this is a lot like using an actual mouse. Although, not to get ahead of myself, I do think it's a mistake to treat gyro exactly the same as mouse, even though the action is similar. Because you can think of a mouse as gyro always on. When you move your mouse, you're always going to move your crosshair in game. And when you pick up your mouse, that's essentially the same action as you turning off your gyro and moving your controller back to a comfortable position. It's the same thing with mouse. You pick up your mouse to put it in another comfortable spot on your mouse pad. But unlike mouse, of course, we can't just pick up our gyro because the gyro is always on or always off, depending on what you prefer. So we have no choice but to dedicate an input on the controller to enabling or disabling the gyro. And there are drawbacks depending on what you use. All right, so here in Steam Input, depending on what controller you're using, you'll have a number of choices to choose from for gyro activation. Now, on a PS4 controller or PS5, you'll probably notice that gyro activation is defaulted to the right side of the touchpad. This is a direct holdover from the Steam controller because the Steam controller used the right touchpad to enable the gyro when you're touching it. And this works extremely well for the Steam controller for reasons that I'm going to show you later in this video. For regular controllers like a PS4 DualSense though, reaching the touchpad for gyro activation can be kind of awkward if you don't have long thumbs. Now, there is a way around this, but for now, let's explore the other options because if you have a Switch Pro controller, well, you don't have access to touch activation at all. So if you're new to gyro, one of the most simple and I guess beginner-friendly ways of using gyro is to just have it on the left trigger or left bumper, depending on which one it is you use to aim. Now, this can be decent for getting used to gyro in the beginning, but if you're tying gyro activation to aiming, then you're completely neglecting the fact that you can aim when you hip fire and not just aim down sights. And so that's why in the long run, I think it's more ideal to use an input that isn't directly tied to an in-game action. And that's a problem when just about every single input on a controller is being used for gameplay. This means if you're going to use a button for gyro activation or deactivation, then that's all that button is going to do. Which is why there is a useful trick to making touch activation a lot easier to manage. So because reaching the touchpad is kind of difficult, if you buy yourself some capacitive tape, which I'll have a link in the description for the one that I use, you can basically replicate an Alpakka controller. And if you're creative enough, you can put the tape wherever you want on the controller, whether it's in between the buttons, on the joystick, which I have tried, or maybe even all the way down to the grips. This is a simple mod that is very useful if you want to use touch activation that is easier to reach. Now, this does work fairly well. I mean, I would say I imagine this is what using an Alpakka controller is like, but I mean, this is literally the exact same thing, which is honestly one of the reasons why I've never really felt the motivation to get one. And from the little that I have tried this, I can see why, and I will show why further in this video, why it's tempting to use gyro in this manner, because you effectively are using the gyro exactly like a mouse. However, in my opinion, I think that's a mistake. While the addition of gyro means that we don't need to use the right joystick for aiming, that doesn't mean we shouldn't use it for camera control. So you could continue to use the right joystick the way you normally would as a regular joystick. But as I've explained in other videos, this means you're using the joystick to aim with time and the gyro to aim with space. And so the ability to actually react to stuff in game that's to your sides or behind you is always going to be limited by time and muscle memory, which the calculations you need to do cognitively to turn around 180 degrees or left and right consistently at higher joystick sensitivities becomes more and more difficult, which is why the next option exists. So what if you could use the right joystick to aim not with time, but with space? Well, that's what flickstick is for. With flickstick, you can now react spatially on the x-axis. So whether it's to your left, directly behind you, or to your right, you can now flick to the exact direction that you need on the x-axis. And this is only on the x-axis because the gyro can do a lot of the heavy lifting for the vertical axis just fine by itself. And so cognitively, this means that your brain doesn't need to do the switch anymore from aiming with time to aiming with space, because now, cognitively, you are always thinking about space. And because flick stick doesn't really rotate you when you flick forward, the last option for gyro activation becomes a lot more viable. And that option is joystick deflection. And this is personally what I've settled on using for flick stick. Now, a bit of a quick bug report here, because this current option in Steam Input doesn't actually work with my controller very well, because as you can see here, my right joystick, it has a lot of drift on it. So I need a big dead zone on it for any of my Steam Input settings to work properly. And currently, the joystick deflect option in Steam Input seems to ignore the calibrated dead zones for Steam Input. So even with the dead zone for flick stick being set to 50%, and with the actual Steam Input calibration settings, it seems that the current deflection options seems to ignore these settings. So I would appreciate a fix. So using my Switch Pro controller, let me show you why I've settled on this style of activation, or rather deactivation. So the reasons are pretty straightforward. By having the gyro always on, it means that if I need to do other things like pressing the face buttons or any other button on the controller while aiming, then I can do that. And because flick stick has the dead zone in front, that's effectively acting as an extra button on the controller that's being dedicated to just turning off the gyro. So this lets me make very frequent and very small micro adjustments on the fly while I'm playing. The only drawback to doing this is that flicking the joystick in any direction and holding the deflection will turn off the gyro. And this means you have to build up a very quick muscle memory of releasing the joystick rather quickly if you are reacting to something that's behind you. And so from my experience and some tests that I'm about to show you, this small little hitch from turning the gyro off while rotating really isn't that big of a deal. And so that's why I've settled on this method, because everything I do with regular controllers and flick stick is in an effort to replicate what I can already do with my Steam controller. And the ironic thing is, using flick stick in the exact opposite manner as my Steam controller is what gets me the closest results, because on a Steam controller, by default, the right touchpad enables the gyro. But the touch activation itself isn't what made gyro on the Steam controller so great. The real reason is because we're pairing gyro activation with a touchpad that gives us full 360-degree coverage on the x-axis and the y-axis. And so with a Steam controller, once you get used to it, swiping to something and then using the gyro to look at it becomes super comfortable. It just takes some practice. By the way, if a mouse needs a mouse pad, then touchpads need thumb sleeves. So if you've had a Steam controller and you just didn't like the way the touchpads felt on your thumbs, this is probably why. Anyways, back to flick stick. You can see now that with the gyro always on, I can now flick to the general location of a target and then look at it with the gyro. And this saves me a lot of physical motion with my hands, just like it does with my Steam controller. Now, if I were to use flick stick enable, then the action is similar but much more awkward, because now I need to flick to the direction of a target, hold the stick, and then look at it with the gyro. My thumb is now in a fairly awkward position, and I'd have to build up the muscle memory and willpower to keep the stick deflected if I were to do this style of activation. And if I were to dedicate just a button to activation, which I can simulate just by flicking forward, then that means I'm using the gyro to do everything. I'm turning my controller, and then I'm looking at the target, which is a lot of extra work. By the way, I'm calibrated to 1:1 right here, which is why I'm turning my controller so much. And so that's why I've settled on the opposite. The other problem with this that you may have noticed is that when I flick the joystick forward, there's all this micro jitter. This is caused by Flickstick's sweep function. Currently, the only way to actually get rid of this is to remove the sweeping entirely. So now you have no more jitter, but now you can't sweep the joystick around anymore. And that's kind of a shame because the sweep function is something that I use rather frequently to make macro adjustments when I'm recentering my gyro. And the front angle dead zone only affects the actual flick direction of Flickstick. This does not affect the sweep binding at all. And so a very simple idea I've had for a while now is why not make a version of the precision speed for sweeping, not just for Flickstick, but also for touchpads. Because while I personally don't really like this on gyro, I think it would be perfect to have on touchpads and on Flickstick sweep. Because who knows, maybe enabling the gyro like this would be useful for some people. So, now that I've explained all of that, let's get to some actual numerical tests. Because now I want to quantify the actual differences between all of the popular different playstyles of gyro. Now, simply talking about the differences in gyro style isn't enough, so I decided to actually conduct some tests. So using Aimlab and using various Audiospatial tasks, I went ahead and compared the averages of Flickstick, Splatoon, which is using only left and right joystick rotation, the Steam controller, and an Alpakka. Now, I don't own an Alpakka controller, so for this, all I did was I used my Steam controller and I disabled the actual touchpad, and I only used the gyro. And this let me simulate roughly the Alpakka experience. Although, yes, I know the Alpakka has its fancy gyro setup. Although I can't say how much the superior gyro would actually affect the scores that you're about to see. Now, the first task that I chose to use for this test is called Surroundshot. In this task, there are 4 doorways, and in each doorway, you will hear the footsteps of the target moving into position. So you have to react spatially to the sound, and then, once the target comes through, you then have to headshot it. And then 2 more targets spawn afterwards. So I chose this task because not only is it measuring your reaction speeds, but it's also measuring your accuracy after you do a big reaction. So first up is Flickstick. Now, for each of these runs, I made sure to actually use each style of gyro until I felt like it was hitting an average score. And then I did 10 runs, and I averaged out those 10 runs. So starting off with Flickstick here, clearly you can see that on a very X-axis heavy task, Flickstick has a bit of a natural advantage. And the benefits of using Flickstick are kind of obvious, because you should be able to see that I'm barely moving my controller. All I have to do is flick in the general direction of where the target is going to be, and then I just use the gyro to make the actual macro adjustment to land the headshot. And so, in this task, I came out to an average of about 90K for Flickstick. So next up is Splatoon. Now, I've never actually played Splatoon, but the style that I'm replicating here is basically just regular joystick rotation, but only on the X-axis. So after practicing with this for a bit, what I found is that hitting 90-degree turns can get fairly easy with some practice. The real difficulty comes from 180-degree turns. And the habit that I started building up was that instead of actually holding the joystick for the entirety of the 180-degree turn, instead I would just tap the joystick twice. For context, I'm actually using Joyshock Mapper here with a setting of 720. And so after a bit of practice, the average I landed on for the Splatoon style is 77,995.7. Okay, next is the Steam controller. And here I do have to acknowledge certain downsides that I feel are holding the touchpad back, because there are two things going on in this gameplay right now. First off, I'm actually using Steam input and Joyshock Mapper here, because Joyshock Mapper finally has some Excel settings that I can actually dial in, which I'll talk about in the future. So I don't know if it's an issue with the fact that I'm combining Steam input with Joyshock Mapper, but there seems to be quite a bit of extra camera movement that is being caused by my thumbs here. Now, I actually use Steam input's high acceleration to actually keep my touchpad sensitivity low. This is why, ideally, I would love it if there was a version of precision speed for the touchpad, because broad touchpad swiping doesn't really need precision. We're only using it for these big reactions. So, with the Steam controller, I averaged out to 84,041.3, and I do feel that the touchpad issues is holding these scores back a little bit. But in a horizontally based task like this, the results so far make sense. And finally, the Alpakka, or my Steam controller without the right touchpad. So I said I'm using Joyshock Mapper, and that's because I am using a dialed-in Excel curve. So with Excel, I'm using it the way you would on a mouse. High sensitivity for big reactions, and low sensitivity for actual precision. Now the difference you should know is that there's a lot more hand movement going on here because I'm using the gyro just like a mouse. And much like a mouse, if the target continues moving in a direction that I can't keep up with, then I effectively run out of mouse pad. Or, in the case of gyro, I run out of wrist. Now, because of the sensitivity I'm using, this didn't really happen much. But I feel that in actual gameplay, this is an issue I would definitely run into very frequently. And so here are the final results. And interestingly enough, I basically averaged the same score as my Steam controller at an average of 85,019.9. But you have to remember, this is with acceleration. This is not a flat gyro sensitivity, which in hindsight, I probably should have tested that. Anyways, even though I did manage to hit basically the same average as my Steam controller with the gyro only, I would still prefer to use a touchpad, because what these numbers don't show is the extra work I'm actually putting in to get these numbers. Going back to the bicycle analogy, you can think of it like this. When you do everything with just the gyro, you're effectively riding a unicycle, because after all, you don't need 2 tires on a bike. You can balance on one, and you can get a lot done on a unicycle. But if you want to save yourself from doing extra work and effort, then it's generally a good idea to supplement gyro with something that gives you spatial control of the camera. So that way you can react to something and have more wrist range to use when you're actually trying to aim at the thing you're aiming at. And overall, this should give you a more comfortable experience. Now, the next test I use is probably the only other spatial test that Aimlab has, which is Audiospatial 8. So even though this is basically the same thing, the precision of the spatial reactions is a lot higher now, with 8 directions instead of 4. So this task will hopefully showcase the difference in precision of each gyro style. So once again, starting off with flick stick, I decided to make a small change. Before I was using 4-way snap, so for this task, I'm using 8-way snap, which for obvious reasons should give flick stick an edge once again. And I did forget to mention this, but I am using the same gyro settings for each style with the exception of the Alpakka style to ensure that it's just the big reaction inputs that are actually affecting the final scores. And so after 10 runs with flick stick, I averaged 279,170.1. And next we have Splatoon again with the exact same settings as before. Now, if doing 180-degree reactions was difficult enough with a 4-way task, then doing an accurate 135-degree rotation is extra difficult with this input style. Now, again, I've never played Splatoon, and I know that there's this technique where they'll use the gyro and the stick to like turn around quickly, but that's for 180 turns. And that's part of the reason why I chose to do this task, because this task measures spatial precision, because turning directly around is surprisingly easier than turning to a specific angle. And so, after all those runs, I averaged out to 254,834.1. Now, with the Steam controller, I'd like to sort of point out a difference between a touchpad and flick stick, because a touchpad does require more practice, wherein flick stick will instantly give you the crazy looking direction snapping that I feel normies kind of overreact to. And the difference is that flick stick doesn't actually flick your camera to a direction until you have fully deflected the joystick. So there is some travel distance between when you start moving your thumb to when your camera actually flicks in a direction. With the touchpad, on the other hand, because it's a touchpad, you have that fine granular control for small directional adjustments. So as you'll see in the results, with practice, a touchpad gives you more spatial precision. And as you can see, I averaged out to 284,564.6. And once again, the Alpakka settings with the reduced vertical sensitivity, because rotating around like this is much easier with a lower vertical sensitivity. And so these results kind of showcase why the idea of using gyro like a mouse is viable. Because if you're willing to put in the extra work, you're actually kind of doing less work. And what I mean by that is, when you're using flick stick or touchpad or Splatoon, your brain has to think about what your thumb is going to do first, and then you switch to using your gyro. But if you do everything with the gyro, then your brain doesn't have to worry about that switch. And I believe that's what's producing the results that you're about to see. 291,061.6. Now, I realize in hindsight that this wasn't the most balanced comparison because I did reduce the vertical scale for the Alpakka setup because I felt like I had to. Because I did try it for a little bit with the same gyro settings before with a 1-to-1 ratio, but I actually struggled quite a bit because I've actually never tried using just the gyro. So if I were to have done that, I'm pretty sure the scores for the Alpakka would be lower. In fact, I think you can see that the consistency I have with different input styles varies quite a bit. And so these results aren't exactly the most balanced. And so that's it for the 2 spatial tests that Aimlab actually has for true spatial reactions. Now on to the next task. So the next task I only really did because it's the only other spatial task that Aimlab has, and that's Spidershot 180. So if you wanted to try and measure just how much of an advantage being able to instantly turn around gives you, then this is the task to measure it with. So once again, with Flickstick, I am using Flickstick Disable, and this task happens to showcase a small problem with that. Because the gyro always disables, regardless of which direction I flick, this means throughout the course of this run, although you can't really see it in the footage, my controller is gradually desynchronizing from its comfort position. So this task becomes harder the longer I do it. And because you can't really see it in this footage, I went ahead and did a cheese run, which I'll go ahead and show you next. And so, with Flickstick Disable, I averaged out to 79,820.7. Now, I call this the cheese run because I'm effectively just using Flickstick as a 180 button. And in this very hyper-specific task, where all you have to do is do a 180 and shoot the targets, yeah, this suddenly becomes a massive advantage in this hyper-specific scenario. Either way, this does bring up an old idea I've had, in that I always felt that perhaps whenever Flickstick is used to disable or enable the gyro, that maybe it would be better if it only did so in the forward dead zone specifically, because the differences here are kind of big. And now, as you can see, I averaged 90,149.4, which shows that those small little hitches build up over time. Granted, in a very hyper-specific scenario. Okay, next up is Splatoon. So once again, doing 180s based on time-based muscle memory is pretty hard. But difficulty aside, the other limiting factor here is the actual rotation speed, which is always going to be limited by time. And a subtle technique that I started developing while doing this task is that I started building up a habit of rotating in the direction that was closest to the 180-degree turn. So if the target is on the left, I'll turn left. If the target is on the right, I'll turn right. And this was the best possible scenario I was able to come up with for this style of rotation. And so even with this technique, I only averaged 69,960.6. And once again, the Steam controller. So here, I am using a full 360 degree pad, meaning when I swipe from one edge of the pad to the other, that's a full 360 degree turn. With practice, doing consistent 180s is perfectly manageable. Now, in the past, I used to use a 180 degree touchpad, and I'm confident if I were to use that here, I would actually get higher scores, because I could then use the edges of the pad as a physical point of feedback for my thumbs to feel the exact 180 degree rotation. But I only did this task with 360 pad, so that's all I'll be showing here for today. And so I averaged 78,676.1. Basically the same as Flickstick with Flickstick Disable. So with the Alpakka setup, I did a couple of things differently. For starters, I'm actually using the regular gyro sensitivity now. So that's the first big change. The second is that if you paid attention at the beginning of the run, I actually rotated the camera 90 degrees to the left. So that way, instead of having to do a full 180 degree flick, I now only have to rotate the controller 90 degrees to the left or 90 degrees to the right, effectively cheesing the task. Because trying to do this task with my current settings legit is just not viable. In fact, I'd probably only even recommend doing this task specifically like this, specifically for the gyro, to help train aiming at the edges of your wrist arc. So, even with this cheese setup, I only managed to average 62,514.6. Now, I'm not really sure what all this says, to be honest, because this is an extremely hyper-specific scenario. It's the idea of reacting to someone behind you who's already shooting you and trying to get a shot on them. And the funny thing is, in real gameplay, if you're already getting shot at directly behind you, even with Flickstick's instantaneous 180 degree turns, there is still going to be a response time from you as an actual player moving your thumb on the stick to initiate that reaction. So even though Flickstick looks OP, in an actual gameplay scenario, it almost never is. But either way, I suppose this skill does come in handy every now and again. But if I were to play this task more, I would actually use it to train the edges of my wrist aim more than actually as a 180 degree task. Now, those are the only tasks Aimlab actually has that I find are actually useful for developing spatial skills with Flickstick or a touchpad. The problem with all of those, though, is that they are all very horizontally fixed tasks, and they don't show the full picture of why I love the Steam controller. So, in order to actually try and show you the difference that a touchpad makes in terms of full spatial comfort, I made a task. So, all you have to do is search for gyro, and you'll find two things here. This thing is an old training routine I had. I don't even remember uploading this, but yeah, this is an old routine I used to do with my Steam controller. I'll probably be making a new one now that I'm doing Aimlab again. But below that, you should find Gyro React. And this is a task I made specifically to train full 360 degree spatial reactions, not just horizontally, but vertically as well. So the way this task works is that targets will randomly spawn around you, not just horizontally, but vertically as well. I've deliberately staggered the way the targets spawn to ensure that you're not developing a rhythm whenever the targets spawn. The idea is for you to actually react to the sound of the target spawning, as opposed to developing a rhythm for the target spawn pattern. The next idea is that not only are you trying to react to the target spawning, but you also have to make sure you have enough gyro left over to actually track the target once you have acquired it. So what you can see here now with Flickstick is that I'm actually deliberately resetting my controller to a horizontal position every time I take out a target, so that way I can then hear where the next target will spawn relative to the horizon. And so with the scoring system I set up, I averaged 2,860. So next up, with the Splatoon setup, another problem arises, and that's gyro activation. Because with the other tasks so far, being horizontally based, I didn't need to activate or deactivate the gyro. But now that I'm constantly looking up and down, I need a way to turn off the gyro. And for that, I'm using the touchpad. Now, there is a way to set up the joystick so that way you can have 2 extra inputs by flicking the joystick forward or down. And so if you were to go for this style of setup, that's what I would suggest you do, using either joystick forward or joystick down to disable the gyro, or enable it, whatever is more comfortable for you. But of course, there is the other option of just using the joystick like a regular joystick, giving you vertical spatial control as well. But to be honest, I really don't think that would make much of a difference, because again, you're still aiming with time and you still have all of those joystick limitations to work with. And so for the Splatoon setup, I averaged 2,730.3. Now for the Steam controller. And hopefully what you'll be able to see here is just how much more comfortable the overall experience is because of the touchpad. Because now I can look around just by swiping on the pad, and I can save the most gyro for when I actually need to aim at the target. Combine that with touch activation, and my ability to recenter my gyro, recenter my controller, and just remain in a comfortable position is quite literally quantifiably higher. Especially in situations where I can't find a target sometimes, that doesn't even matter because swiping around the full 360-degree space is super easy with a touchpad. And as I've said earlier in the video, I still think the touchpad experience can easily be improved. There is so much more you can do with a touchpad to make it even better. It's just a shame that the touchpad inputs have quite literally been pushed to the sides. Anyways, as you can now quantifiably see, with the Steam controller, I averaged 2,903.4. And finally, for good measure, my Alpakka simulation. I'm using a sensitivity of 6.71 with a natural Excel curve. And for me, this does give me full spatial coverage with my wrist arc. So this task is surprisingly manageable, and I can indeed do everything with just the gyro. As I've said before though, the only reason why I don't do this is because with the touchpad, and even with flickstick, I prefer a more comfortable experience overall. And the less I need to use the gyro, the more comfortable I am. Because the overall gyro experience, in my opinion, is a balance of comfort and consistency. If comfort is queen, then consistency is king. And you need a balance of the two to have the best experience. It's just a matter of how much comfort it is you're willing to sacrifice to achieve whatever it is you're trying to do. So again, personally, I do value comfort. So even though I can do everything with the gyro, it's not something I plan on doing anytime soon. And so, once again, surprisingly, with just the gyro, I managed to average 2,848.1. And so there you go. I hope that this task I made quantifiably shows you why I like the Steam controller. And this isn't even getting into all of the utility stuff that you can do with a touchpad, because regular controllers suffer from the limited space of 4 buttons and a joystick and a D-pad and all that stuff. But once you learn how to use touchpads and you learn how to use Steam input properly, you can do so much more. So on the topic of learning how to use Steam input, let me show you what I'm pretty sure is a fairly well-known trick for the Splatoon style of camera control. Because as you can see here, flicking up turns off my gyro, and if I go left, I have analog rotation, and right as well. And if I flick the joystick down, look at that, flick stick. So here's how you can set this up. So to start off, you're going to change the right stick to a directional pad. And to get the easy thing out the way first, you're just going to use the turn camera setting. So just lower the spin duration to whatever you like. I'll use 65 here and 180. So now that's the flick stick 180. Now for turning left and right, we need to create 2 action layers. So on my gameplay action set, I'm going to add a layer and I'm going to call this butterfly, because the effect and the layout kind of resembles a butterfly. And we're also going to make one for the gyro off. So first up, the gyro. Make sure you're on gyro off. All you're going to do is change this to disabled. Now back to the main action set. I'm going to go back to the joystick. Joystick up. I'm going to go to action set. Hold set layer. And you can remove these. It's up to you. And you're going to choose gyro off. Now for turning left and right, we're going to do add action set, butterfly. Same thing for the right. Now on the butterfly action set, you're going to go to the joystick, and you're going to go to the right joystick. You're going to change this to joystick mouse or actual joystick if you can make that work with mixed input. But since this is a pure keyboard and mouse layout, joystick mouse. Now on the outer ring, you're going to do release action layer. And you're going to leave it at butterfly. And now you're going to click the gear, and you're going to change this from a regular press to a release press. And you're going to want to go up here to adjust the outer ring binding radius to whatever your dead zone is. So you're going to have to feel this out to find what works most consistently with your settings. As for the mouse sensitivity, because we're only using it to rotate horizontally, you can reduce the vertical scale to 0. Now back on the main action set, you're going to want to change the directional pad setting to 4-way no overlap. And this should make things a little bit more consistent. And so now you should be able to test it out and see that everything should work just fine. Experiment with different settings and try and dial it in if you want. Just keep in mind that this is using action layers, and action layers and stuff can get finicky with Steam input. The more complicated your controller layout becomes with action layers and sets, the more prone it is to random behaviors. So there you go. Like I said, I'm pretty sure this is a fairly well-known trick that if you're new to gyro, maybe this can help ease you into flickstick. But I do think it's just better overall to take the training wheels off entirely and just commit, because gyro is just like any other skill. The only way to get better at it is to just keep doing it until your brain figures it out. Now, I do bring this trick up for another reason, because this trick, while I've never actually used it, it has given me an idea in the back of my head for quite some time now for a different version of flickstick. So the way flickstick currently works is that it currently depends on which edge of the joystick's, edge you actually touch. So if you touch here, you flick 90 degrees, here 180, here negative 90 degrees or 90 degrees to the left. You know what I'm saying. So currently, flickstick doesn't actually rotate you until you touch the edge of the joystick's deflection. And the way sweep bindings work is that it's based on the outer edge. Sweeping around is what rotates you in game. But the butterfly layout gave me an idea. If we reserve the forward and down for input dead zones, if you will. So for Gyro Disable, up and down for something else. Instead of having flick stick be activated at the edges, what if instead there were a dead zone and flick stick started sending out data for an exact position left and right 180 degrees in both directions? So 90 degrees would be halfway in the middle of each direction. So I hope this makes sense as to what I'm trying to explain. In fact, let me just show you what it is that I'm trying to say. So here on the right joystick, I've set up the mouse region. So now imagine a version of this where when I flick to the left, you can see I have gradual control left and right. So imagine that instead of this screen space jank right now, imagine instead that this rotates you 180 degrees left and 180 degrees right, only on the x-axis. I think something like this could be an alternative that gives you 2 extra bindings with up and down. So I don't know if this is an original idea, but if it is, I'm calling it the butterfly stick. And this most definitely would be a lot harder to get used to than regular flick stick, but the utility of having an extra binding might be worth it. Also, because the camera starts moving the moment I start moving the stick, this actually feels kind of similar to touchpad swiping. And also an actual version of this wouldn't snap you back to the center. So there you go. There's another idea. I'm sure if I really wanted to, I could get creative with Steam inputs, bindings, and I could make something that works like what I'm describing, but I just haven't really bothered to. Okay, never mind. Scratch that. While making this video, I realized how I could actually set this up. Well, something like this. So on the left and right for the joystick, I have set up 45-degree rotations with the camera setting, with a 0 millisecond turn duration. Now, on all of these, I've set these to a soft press. And under the settings for the soft press, I've adjusted the threshold for each setting. So the first 45 degrees is 1/4. The second is halfway. The third is 3/4. And the last one is basically maxed out. I've also disabled the interruptible function on all of these. So now I have made something that does resemble what I'm trying to describe. It doesn't work perfectly. It's a little off every now and again, but as you can see, if I rotate the controller to the left, it almost gets me in 180 degrees. I got to tweak the soft press thresholds, it seems, but there you go. 180 degrees left, 180 degrees right. Just imagine that an actual version of this would be a smooth rotation as you're flicking the stick. So there you go. I guess that's usable. I'll probably test this out, but I'm not sure when, because to be honest, I'm perfectly content with using flick stick right now and my Steam controller. Okay, so while I'm on the topic of Steam input and all of the binding stuff that you can do with it, I'd like to just go on a bit of a tangent here to quickly show you exactly why I love the Steam controller, by showing you what's probably my favorite Star Wars game, Jedi Knight Academy. Now, this game is special because it's a PC game, an old PC game. Because old PC games give you quite a few bindings to work with, because in old PC games, devs just gave you basically literally everything in the game to work with. And so, let me just walk you through everything that I have mapped on this controller. Let's start off with the easy stuff. So when I click the left bumper, this lets me choose from every weapon in the game, with the concussion rifle in the center since it's the most powerful gun. Basically this game's BFG. Now, on the right touchpad, you can see my overlay, where you can see 5 zones. And I've designed this overlay to show what I usually like to do in most games, which is when I click the right touchpad, I actually have 5 extra inputs here. So if I click down, I can switch to third-person mode. If I click left, I can switch to my lightsaber. And now this is where Jedi Knight Academy is really neat, because not only do you have a lightsaber, but you can change lightsaber stances. And I do that by clicking to the right. And clicking up, if there was anything for me to interact with, would be click up to interact. And even though I just made this whole video showcasing why I don't need it, I can actually click the center of the pad to recenter my camera, because I have so much extra space. Now, so far, I could map most of that to a regular controller. But Jedi Knight Academy is special because this game basically gives you access to every single force power, which I can access on the touchpad by clicking my left touchpad. And with a little bit of practice and muscle memory, I could use every single force power in the game if I wanted to. And that's not something that I think I could actually do with a regular controller, because I know that a Switch version of this game exists, and I'm pretty sure the Switch version probably does the same thing that you would actually do with the keyboard, which is you would click Q and E to cycle through each individual force power one at a time. But with the Steam controller, again, I have access to every single force power instantaneously. And yeah, I'll be straight up. I think this is a objectively superior experience for this game. In fact, it could be even better if these square touch menus were actually designed as hexagons, because hexagons fit inside of a round pad much better than squares. And while I've already explained in other videos why I prefer the round touchpad, because touchpads can be used for more than just camera control, because touchpad movement is also something else that I feel is superior to joystick movement. Because I don't know if you've noticed, I have not touched the joystick or the ABXY buttons once, because I always reserve these inputs for things like menu navigation. So for example, B opens up the actual menu, Y opens up load menu, X opens up save menu, and because this is an old school PC game, I can hold X to quick save, and then hold Y to quick load. And then I have A set to enter, but I actually don't remember what that does. Anyways, so the point is, I have everything in the game mapped to this controller, and that's just something I can't really do with regular controllers. Like, I'm sure I could get close, but the overall comfort experience is just, for me, objectively the best with dual touchpad gaming. So yeah, there you go. I hope this quick example showcases why I love this controller so much. Because once you get used to dual touchpad inputs, the comfort is unmatched. Hands down. But that's just my opinion. Alright, now all that was a bit of a tangent, so if you are new to gyro and you are trying to get used to flick stick or a touchpad, let me go ahead and give you a few pointers on how you can get used to it more quickly. So the first thing is I would recommend trying out the tasks that I've shown in this video. And you can go ahead and try out my task, because I do plan on making more, because now that I have access to custom Excel curves, I'm going to be doing Aimlab again. And I figure since I'm going to be playing this game more again, I'm going to be making more gyro specific tasks to hopefully help you get the most out of gyro. Because I think the most logical way to think about it is that gyro is for aiming at what you see, and flick stick and touchpads is for aiming at what you hear. Because, in a way, you can technically aim with your ears. And that's what flick stick and touchpads are for. And in the same way that having a high refresh rate monitor is good for your eyes, it's also a good idea to have good audio settings to improve your spatial accuracy when it comes to audio. And so the best investment you can possibly make to instantly improve your audio experience is to buy yourself some open back headphones like these. So a quick audio lesson to understand what the deal is with these kinds of headphones. Now, most headphones that you find on the market, especially like gaming headphones, are what's called closed back headphones. And what that means is that you have the speaker in the headphone that looks something like this. You got your magnet, and then you have the diaphragm that moves forward and backwards to produce sound. Now, a closed back headphone is just that. The back is closed because the speaker is inside of a closed cup. And what this does is that it prevents sound from leaking out this way. So that way, only you are hearing the music that you're listening to. Now, there is a small problem with this, and that is because the speaker is enclosed, the speaker itself is not allowed to vibrate forward and backwards evenly because all the pressure is building up inside the closed space. And so this basically means with closed back headphones, all of the music and stuff that you're listening to is fundamentally muffled and warped. And quite simply put, it just doesn't sound realistic. Now with open back headphones, on the other hand, like what I just showed you, there's a port at the back that is open, the open back, that allows pressure to exit in this direction, allowing the speaker to vibrate in both directions evenly. So now, because the speaker can move back and forth freely, it naturally produces more realistic audio. And this realism is extremely useful for gaming. Now, the only downside of this is because it's open back, everyone's going to hear what you're listening to now. And so this is why stuff like 7.1 surround sound emulation exists. Because for closed back headphones, you need to try and emulate the real spatial feel with emulation. And most audio processing does that by simulating a 7.1 surround sound, which isn't real life, it is this. What 7.1 surround sound means is that it's just describing the number of speakers that the sounds are coming from. So the 0.1 is the subwoofer. This is your bass. The 7 speakers is 1 speaker above the bass, 2 to the right. Let's say you are in the middle here. You have 2 behind you. And then there's usually 2 off to the side somewhere. And so this is what 7.1 surround sound is simulating. And I don't know about you, but there's kind of an obvious problem with this if you're going to be using this for gaming, especially with flick stick, because this isn't really conducive to precise spatial reactions. This is just kind of an arbitrary standard that is being simulated, because this isn't real life. This is 7 speakers and a bass speaker. So if 7 speakers isn't real life, how many speakers do you need to actually simulate real life? Is it 1,000? Infinity? Well, no. It's only 2 because you only have 2 ears. So that's what 2 surround sound is. It's just your left speaker and right speaker on your headphones. That's all it takes to simulate realistic 3D audio. And that's why for realistic audio, you want open back headphones. It's 2 speakers on each of your ears that is given the best opportunity to replicate realistically the sounds you should be hearing. And so that's why I personally don't really recommend 7.1 surround sound simulation like Boom 3D Audio or DTS, because they're only simulating a 7.1 surround sound, which can sound nice, especially if you're a bass head, but for gaming, it's just not what you want. Now, from my experience, the only one I actually would recommend is Dolby Access or Dolby Atmos, because Dolby Atmos actually is a little bit different from other surround sound simulations in that it's simulating way more speakers to begin with. I actually don't remember off the top of my head how many speakers it's simulating, but it's more than 7.1. And on top of being way more accurate spatially than 7.1 surround sound simulation, Dolby Atmos also has a height channel simulation. So where regular surround sound sims just do 7.1 surround sound in a X-axis 2D space, Dolby Atmos actually does things in 3D with its surround sound simulation. And so Dolby Atmos can also simulate sound that's coming from above you as well as around you. So it's like legitimately 3D, and it actually does sound quite nice in a lot of games. So I do recommend Dolby Atmos, especially because it's the most affordable option to improve your audio experience, especially if you have closed back headphones. If you have closed back headphones, then use Dolby Atmos. And if you have open back headphones, you should use whatever is available in a game natively. But if a game doesn't have anything native, then use Dolby Atmos. There is one more option that I've only just started using, and I gotta say, it blows everything else out of the water. Like, I kind of wish I was sponsored to say this stuff or something, because like it is genuinely amazing. So the last option you have to choose from is this: a personalized profile audio setting by Immerse Game Pack. Like, I'm only using the trial right now for this thing in Warzone, and it's the real deal. Like, even with my open back headphones, it is night and day how much more accurate audio sounds with these settings, because this is a technology I've known about. I didn't know that a version of this tech already existed in a game already, because I know Dolby also has been working on a version of this. And what this is essentially they tweak the audio and do who knows what to it based on the shape of your ears. And in this case, for Warzone, it even does it for your entire head. And man, like, it's the real deal. It is night and day how much more 3D the audio sounds after you set this up. Like, seriously, I wish I was being paid to say this stuff. Like, I am not sponsored. I am only using the free trial of this thing because I can't really afford the whole thing. But like, man, I can only hope that maybe Dolby will release their version of HRTF in the future, but I've been waiting for that for a while, because I first learned about HRTF audio stuff from Dolby, because I heard about this a ways back. And yeah, I mean, I don't really know what else to say, but this is the real deal. If you have the money for it, yeah, this stuff is legit. I mean, I really don't know what else to say. Although, this is only my opinion for this native game-specific version of this that they have. The universal desktop version of this seems to be just standard 7.1 surround sound with HRTF enhancement. So, yeah, I'm not really sure what's different about this native implementation, but the game pack versions of this sound amazing, and I do recommend it. But I'm not fully convinced about their desktop version. Okay, well, I think that's everything. I'm not sure if I forgot anything, but hopefully I've shared enough stuff to sort of explain why I do things the way I do. Because, like I said, everything I do with regular controllers is in an effort to replicate what I can already do with my Steam controller. Because my Steam controller does give me the most comfortable experience. But yeah, so As for other things that I'll be doing, like I said, I do plan on doing Aimlab again this year. And, well, I've already started, and I'll show you where I'm at the end here. And, well, because I'm going to be doing Aimlab more again, I am going to be making more custom gyro-specific tasks, because I do have a few more ideas for some very specific scenarios that tend to annoy me personally. So I guess that's something else I'll be doing, if you're interested. And yeah, well, if you're interested, I think you already know what to do. So, until next time, I'll catch you later.